One of the most exciting things to see in wrestling is a good return. Think of Triple H coming back from his quad tear in 2002, or John Cena surprising everyone with his Royal Rumble appearance in 2008 if you need any examples of this. Unfortunately though, not all returns are created equal, and some go in the opposite direction, flopping spectacularly in the process. But what are the worst comebacks in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the time the Outsiders returned to the WWE in 2002. Yes, right around the same time as the Game was having an all-time great comeback, 3 former WWF roster members were making their return after a lengthy and highly successful spell over in WCW. But while we can't exactly include Hulk Hogan in this video given how well his year ended up going, we certainly can include the other 2 people in the equation, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Why is that? Well, because despite being hyped up to the hills prior to their debut as being the group who were going to inject the company with a lethal dose of poison, the former Diesel and Razor Ramon turned out to be more than a light-skin irritant than anything else. After all, their idea of taking over the company as they had done down south ended up amounting to little more than them screwing Steve Austin out of the undisputed title and then proceeding to spend the next few weeks getting beaten up by him. In fact, in the only real match of note either man had during this run, Hall would be defeated by Stone Cold in a mid-card bout at WrestleMania 18. And not long after that, the bad guy would be released from his contract altogether. Then there was Kevin Nash. What do we say about him? Well, he rarely hit the ring himself, and whenever he did, he was usually getting injured almost instantly. So to say he made little impact then would be an understatement, but then many of the things about WCW being brought over to WWF turned out to be a catastrophic failure in the end. So maybe we shouldn't have been surprised about this one. One thing that did surprise us, however, was how badly botched our next subject was when he had a big return to the Fed and subsequent retirement tour after years of having been away. That's right, it's time to talk about Kurt Angle. Now, this one really should have been a home run. After all, you had one of the greatest and most beloved wrestlers of all time doing his last leg before hanging up his boots for good. And sure, by this point, injuries meant Kurt was a shadow of the performer he'd been during his peak, but that didn't mean you couldn't work around such a fact and give him the exit he deserved. But this was WWE in 2019, one of the lower points in company history. So instead of the Olympic hero getting a proper send-off, he'd have a few limp matches on Raw, all en route to preparing for his final opponent at WrestleMania 35. And that opponent would be, clearly, John Cena, the man who had confronted Angle on his first night in the roster back in 2002, right? Well, unfortunately, what we got instead was for Baron Corbin to wrestle Kurt in his retirement bout and beat him, something which very few fans were happy about. Hell, even the Pittsburgh native himself has since opened up about how disappointed he was with this decision. But there was little he could do about it at the time, so instead of the former world champion getting a big-time send-off against a legend, he went down to the guy who would later get showered in dog food by Roman Reigns. You can see why this was a period when a lot of people were checking out of the product then. Thankfully for WWE though, over the last few years, Triple H has done a lot to rectify the mistakes of the past and bring viewers back into the fold. But that doesn't mean he's been perfect, especially when it comes to returns, as our next subject, Dexter Lumis, proves. Yes, there was a period immediately after the Game took over control of creative in New York that he seemed to be bringing someone new back every week. And while some of these went great, such as Bray Wyatt and Chelsea Green, others were not so successful. Of course, perhaps no example was more botched than Dexter Lumis. After all, while he was a fun, creepy comedy act on NXT for a while, he was always presented as a lower-card character. And that soon became apparent for everyone to see, as not long after debuting on Raw in August of that year, he'd be lost in the shuffle in record time. But then it wasn't as if there was much call for him to be given a bigger role on the show anyway, as even when he was getting TV time, Lumis just wasn't able to cut the mustard on account of the limiting gimmick he had. Really, there was just nothing to work with here, and that's why the most notable feud he was a part of ended up being the absolutely god-awful program featuring him, The Miz, and Johnny Gargano. Could things have worked out better if he'd been used in more of an R-Truth-like mascot role, or if he'd been paired up once more with his on-screen wife, Indy Hartwell? Maybe. But we'll never know because that's not what happened. No, what happened instead was proof that not everything the King of Kings has done while he's been in charge has been great. Still though, for as much of a flop as Dexter Lumis turned out to be upon his return to the company, at least he wasn't as big of a flop as our next group of subjects. And that's because they went from being one of NXT's top prospects to a running joke so fast, it almost gave us whiplash. Who are we talking about here? Why, Hit Row, of course. That's right, the faction who, at one point, appeared to have something special going on down in the developmental brand, were never able to recapture that same magic once WWE brought them back in 2022 post-firing. And one of the main reasons for this being the case, they didn't have Swerve Strickland with them anymore. Sure, the other three members certainly had a role to play, with Top Dollar, Ashanti the Adonis, and B-Fab all doing their jobs as well as could be expected in this area, but back during their initial run in 2020 and 2021, it was clear that the real star of the show was the man then going by the name of Isaiah Swerve Scott. Unfortunately for WWE though, by the time the game took over and wanted to bring the group back, Swerve had already been signed up with AEW and was there beginning the process of rising up their ranks as one half of the tag team champions, Swerve and Our Glory. And that meant that when the other three members of Hit Row did return, they were missing the sauce which had made them so special in the first place. It would be like having the Wyatt family without Bray Wyatt, or the Undisputed Era without Adam Cole. It just wasn't the same once the headlining act was gone. So after Hit Row re-debuted in this fashion in August of 2022 then, fans quickly lost interest in them as it became clear there wasn't a lot to get excited about anymore. But for as bad as this wet fart of a reintroduction was for the group, things hadn't hit their lowest point yet, because after botching a suicide dive on a subsequent episode of SmackDown, Top Dollar in particular would turn into a bit of a recurring joke for Michael Cole on the commentary booth, with this only serving to bury any hopes the trio had left of regaining their lost footing. So perhaps it shouldn't come as a surprise that as of the time of this video's recording, the stable have been completely disbanded, with B-Fab moving on to a role in Bobby Lashley's The Pride stable, Ashanti the Adonis starting a tag team with Cedric Alexander, and Top Dollar getting released from WWE once more, and now working in TNA. Could things have been different if they'd just been able to bring Swerve back with them? Possibly. But we don't see him returning to the Fed anytime soon, as he's likely to become AEW's next world champion the way things stand right now. Of course, even this isn't the end of the bad returns which happened in 2022 though, as there were plenty more yet to come. And our next example was particularly egregious, as during her time away from WWE between 2017 and that year, Emma had proven she was more than capable of getting over if the company she worked for would just get behind her. It didn't matter if it was her brief run in Ring of Honor during 2018 and 2019, where she had matches against the likes of Mandy Leon, Kelly Klein, and Brandy Rhodes, or her more well-remembered time in Impact after that, where she became a one-time Knockouts Tag Team Champion alongside Madison Rayne. It was clear to anyone who was watching her at the time that Emma had what it took to be a player. It's just a shame this wouldn't be the fate which awaited her when she returned to SmackDown in October of 2022 then, as there, she'd immediately be booked to lose. And we don't mean that figuratively either. No, in her very first match back, Emma would be jobbed out to someone else we'll be getting to in a moment. And after that was over, things only continued to get worse for the Australian, as upon having a weak showing at the 2023 Royal Rumble, she'd mill around on the blue brand for a while longer, doing absolutely nothing of note, up until the point she was drafted over to Raw in the summer. Would things go better for her there? Well, by the time September came around, she'd have been released from her contract once more, with her this time being cut along with her real-life boyfriend Riddick Moss. So no, we suppose we could say things didn't go better for her here. In fact, so bad would her run on the red brand be, Emma is apparently considering never returning to the ring again as it stands right now. And that would be a terrible shame if this is what happens, because we should never let it be forgotten that even before the Four Horsewomen, Emma and Paige first sparked the fires of the women's revolution down in NXT in 2013. Of course, had WWE been more serious about their women's division prior to this, they wouldn't have needed a revolution in the first place. And for an example of just how weak the state of the WWE women's division was in the 2000s, you only have to look at our next subject, Gail Kim, when she returned in 2009. Yes, after already having proven herself to be one of the best women's wrestlers in the world after first leaving WWE in 2004, and from there heading over to TNA where the ladies were actually allowed to perform, you'd have thought Gail Kim would have been treated like a much bigger deal when she went back to her original home towards the end of the decade. But unfortunately, this was 2009, the height of the Divas era, where women wrestlers weren't taken as seriously as they are today, so there was little hope for the 7-time Knockouts champion. No, what happened to her instead was that she was immediately booked to job to the likes of Maurice and Kelly Kelly in sub-5-minute matches where they were barely allowed to do anything. That's right, it was a far cry from the days of stealing the show in TNA and main event spots. But that wasn't even the worst of it, because as time went on, things hit an even lower point, with perhaps the lowest point of all for one of the best women's wrestlers in the world being when she was utterly lost in the shuffle during a 25 women's battle royal at WrestleMania 25, which turned out to be more of a mini Kid Rock concert than a match. So it comes as a little surprise then that Kim eventually took matters into her own hands and walked out of the company after eliminating herself from another nothing battle royal on an episode of Raw in August of 2011. After all, WWE clearly weren't going to do anything with her at the time, and her skills were always going to be better served back over in TNA. But while you might have expected a women's wrestler to fail in that era of WWE, you wouldn't necessarily have thought the same thing would happen in 2022. Certainly not when you're talking about someone who's as big of a star as our next subject, Ronda Rousey. And this one can't be blamed on Triple H either, as Ronda's big return following her pregnancy happened while Vince McMahon was still in charge. So what was the reason behind the baddest woman on the planet failing to impress so much this time around, especially as during her initial run, she'd gotten rave reviews from just about everyone? Well, the answer appears to be that, for one reason or another, she just wasn't able to get herself over during promo segments. That's right, at times it almost looked like she was bored out there in the ring while talking on the mic. And that's strange to say the least, because as a lifelong pro wrestling fan, Ronda had clearly been overjoyed to find herself in the position she was in prior to that, with this being main eventing WrestleMania and exceeding everyone's expectations of what she could do inside the squared circle. Had the fact she was getting booed towards the end of her first run soured the former MMA star to the point she was no longer having fun? It's impossible to say for sure. Whatever the reason though, the end result was the same, and this was that after returning at the 2022 Royal Rumble, she proceeded to take part in a disappointing WrestleMania match against Charlotte Flair, in which it felt like much of her star aura had evaporated. And as if that weren't bad enough, she would go on to have even worse feuds against the likes of Liv Morgan and Shayna Baszler, with the latter one giving us one of the worst matches of 2023, their faux MMA bout at that August SummerSlam. And this one appears to have been the final straw for Ronda as it happens, because following it she would go back into sabbatical mode, with it currently looking unlikely she's ever going to return to wrestling full-time. No, even a random appearance on Ring of Honor wasn't enough to see her and Tony Khan make a deal. And with WWE appearing to have cooled off on her, Rousey's future looks to be outside of combat sports going forward. However, we're sure she'll one day return for a Hall of Fame induction, just like our next subject did when he was inducted. Who are we talking about here? None other than Jake the Snake Roberts, and the time he made his return to WWF in 1996. That's right, despite being a big star of WWF's golden era, Roberts would bounce from company to company throughout the 90s. And that was why, following a somewhat bitter exit from the WWF in 1992 and a subsequent failed run in WCW, Roberts found himself once again under the employ of Vince McMahon during the middle of the decade. Of course, with him being at the heights of his on and off again addiction issues here though, it was always going to be touch and go as to whether or not he would succeed. And that might have given WWF some initial pause as to whether or not they wanted to go all the way with him then, causing the Snake to stumble out of the starting gate. But even if he did stumble initially, there was no reason the Texan couldn't have picked himself up and continued forward with a strong performance at that year's King of the Ring tournament. Hell, the whole thing seemed to be centered around his redemption story, in fact. Unfortunately though, in the end, 1996 would turn out to be the year of Austin 316. And because of that, Jake's big Cinderella moment ended up evading him, as from there he began slipping back down the card once more, all while his drug issues took hold again. Really, it's one of the biggest tragedies in wrestling that Roberts couldn't get himself together at this time, as when he was at his best, there were few in the world who could compete with him, particularly when it came to cutting promos. Back then, however, it just wasn't meant to be, and so his limp comeback came to an untimely end in 1997, with him losing one final match to Salvatore Sincere on an episode of Shotgun Saturday Night. Still, at least Jake would eventually get the redemption he deserved, because as it stands today, he's mostly sober and has a job with AEW as the manager of Lance Archer. And he's not the only person who got that chance of redemption later on down the line, as the exact same thing happened with Carito. What happened here exactly? Well, after a good run with the WWE between 2004 and 2010, the son of Carlos Colon ended up leaving the promotion. Thankfully, that wouldn't be his last time inside a WWE ring, however, as years later, in early 2021, he'd return. That said, this was a less than spectacular comeback all around, because rather than being the returning legend who could get a spot in the mid-card where he could challenge for the likes of the Intercontinental title, all this re-debut amounted to was a cameo appearance at that year's Royal Rumble, and then one subsequent tag match on an episode of Raw, pitting him and Jeff Hardy against Elias and Jackson Ryker before he was out the door all over again. Why such a short run? It's unclear exactly. But whatever the reason, it didn't create much fan excitement for Carlito, and so didn't lead to a wave of online support for him to return. Of course, as we all know now though, this was rectified to some degree in 2023, as it was at this point Triple H brought the Puerto Rican back for the second time, with him faring better as a member of the newly reformed LWO. Hell, just go back and watch his entrance during the Bad Bunny Damian Priest San Juan street fight at that May's Backlash and tell us he wasn't a superstar to those fans. Yes, it just goes to show how much perception can be affected by the way someone is booked. And during that initial comeback run in 2021, there was no strong booking to help Carlito get re-established with a whole new audience. But sometimes even good booking won't do anyone making a comeback any good, as it's simply destined to fail from the offset. And that's exactly what happened to our next subject, because when Test returned to WWE in 2006 and was promptly hidden away on the WWE CW brand, it pretty much killed any aura he had left. Now, Test was never a main eventer or anything, but he certainly had a role during the Attitude Era. So it should have made sense for his return to WWE during the mid-2000s to be treated with some degree of fanfare then. Unfortunately though, this just wasn't in the cards for him, as for one reason or another, Vince McMahon didn't feel like he could make money with him anymore. So instead of going to Raw or SmackDown where he could return to his previous role of a solid mid-card act, Andrew Martin was shipped away to WWE CW. And given so few people were watching the show at this point, his big re-debut had all the impact of a pebble hitting a window. Sure, he did try to do the best he could with what he'd been given down in what was effectively a developmental brand, but it was clear right away that this one was never going to work, as fans didn't want any more ex-WWE guys filling up what was supposed to be an extreme roster. No, what they wanted instead was more space for legends like the Sandman and Sabu to work with then up-and-coming performers such as CM Punk. Obviously then, this meant Test had no natural spot in such an idealized version of ECW in 2006, and because of that, whenever he did appear, live audiences went mild. And those reactions continued all the way up until February of the following year as it happened, at which point the former on-screen fiancé of Stephanie McMahon was fired again. Yes, it's a shame Test never got a better second run with WWE, because at this point, he was still young enough to have a lot left to offer. Hell, he could have even went back up to the main roster of Raw or SmackDown and been pushed for a main event run against the likes of John Cena or Batista. And if this didn't work out, he could have at least been booked as a performer who could get the next generation over. But unfortunately, this never happened, and so in the end, this will always go down as a failed return, just as every other example we've looked at today will go down in the same way.